For most folks in the room, we have all seed and Series A SaaS entrepreneurs. So those who are much like yourself, although you've recently raised a very large Series B, so that's now started to change over time. But wanted to really spend some time digging into what were some lessons that you've learned as you've gone from seed to Series A, and when you first started, you came from a background in game design. So would really love to spend some time on sort of the vision for Superhuman and how that initial idea came about.
Sure. So this isn't my first email company. It's not my first productivity company. And the vision really came out of the last one, Reportive. And we had built the first Gmail plugin to scale to millions of users. On the right-hand side of Gmail, when people emailed you, we showed you what they looked like and where they worked and their recent tweets and links to their social media profiles. And I didn't really build that thinking this would be an incredible business. I just built it because I wanted it for me, thought it would be useful. And it turned out lots of people wanted it, specifically lots of salespeople and lots of recruiters who, and I didn't know this at the time, but who, as it turns out, are LinkedIn's bread and butter. So we ended up selling that company just shy of 2 years later to LinkedIn. And then when I was at LinkedIn, I ran all of our email integrations. I saw the company scale incredibly rapidly. I think when I joined, it was around 1,500 people. When I left, we were getting close to 10,000. And it was my responsibility to get LinkedIn social profiles inside of email clients. And so I became very familiar with how professionals do email, and the TLDR is quite badly. And so I started to dig into why, and I saw that bizarrely Gmail was getting worse every single year. I don't know how many of us remember Gmail in 2004, 2005 when it came out, but it was really fast, it was really clean, it did one thing, email, it did it really, really well. But over the years, it's sort of become cluttered and slow. It's the single biggest reason Gmail inside of Chrome, why your laptop runs out of battery. It still doesn't really work properly offline, and so on. And then on top of that, people were installing extensions like my own, Reportive, but also since then things like Boomerang and Clearbit and Mixmax and Yesware, and there's a big long list. And each of these extensions takes the problems I just identified, things like CPU and memory usage and battery performance and offline, and makes all of them dramatically worse. So we imagined, what would it be like if you were to build Gmail, but from scratch, and with today's technology? And then we came to the conclusion that it would be blazingly fast, it would be visually gorgeous, everything would happen instantly, you wouldn't need any plugins or browser extensions, you'd be able to drive the whole thing from the keyboard, and that's how we came up with the idea.
That's awesome. And when you think about, I think Superhuman has the design component and more of the usability angle, which is shortcuts. How did you think about shortcuts, and were you at all concerned of would there be a learning curve? Is this something that an everyday person could adopt? Like, how did you think about the sort of risk and reward profile for some of the features that you build?
We consistently take a no-compromise approach to speed. So if there is a thing that we confidently believe will make our users faster, and an example is keyboard shortcuts, then we're like, cool, we'll do whatever it takes to make this a reality. And so that was one of the reasons why we do this one-to-one concierge onboarding. For those who don't know, we actually onboard every single user in a one-to-one 30-minute video call. And for some people, that's teaching them the really esoteric power user features of the product, and that's fine. But for many people, it's actually just saying, hey, this is a keyboard. This is what keyboard shortcuts look like. Here is how you teach yourself the rest. We've come up with this Command K paradigm to learn them really, really fast. And for those people, we're turning them from people who don't know how to use computers particularly fast into power users of our software.
Yeah, that's awesome. Did you find, with the 30-minute meeting, are there certain types of people or even certain job functions that are more open to that? Because I sort of feel like with that sort of onboarding, did you notice any risks or any struggles in even getting that 30 minutes on their calendar?
Yes, and that's by design. If you're the kind of person who can't carve out 30 minutes to save multiple hours a week or many, many hours a month, then you probably don't have the growth mindset that's required to actually learn new habits and generally become brilliant at what you do. So it's very much there for a reason. We don't want folks who are just like, oh, I wonder what all the hype is about, let's come try this thing out. We really want folks who are serious about being faster at doing their email.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of hype, I'd love to spend some time really talking about brand, community, referrals. I feel like when people say the superhuman for X, like that's very much a desired outcome where people want to build a product that has hype on social media, that individuals share with their friends, and I think most importantly, a product that people are willing to pay for themselves, knowing that there are other options available that are entirely free. So how did you think about brand and sort of what has been the sort of vision from day one?
Yeah, I really hope, and I'm going to ask the help of everyone in the room here, that we can make sure that Superhuman for X doesn't mean hype, because that's not the most helpful. To me, what I think it means is take a market often dominated by incumbents. In our case, you only have two. There's Gmail and there's Outlook. A market that's often considered dead, right? There is no point going into it. It's too hard. You need too much money. And even when you spend the money, you're unlikely to end up with anything better. Those are sort of the preconditions. Then you build a 10x experience. You slice out a premium segment. You figure out a go-to-market that makes the product attractive, and you layer in some of these philosophies like our no-compromise approach to speed and to offline and the fine details that make the product special. So to me, that's what Superhuman for X is, and it really isn't about us. I'm just talking about a premium strategy, right? You can apply this to so many different industries where there hasn't been much innovation for a while. You just go in, identify what the top 1% of that market really cares about, build that, and then charge a fair premium for that product.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, and it's interesting to see, I mean, you obviously have a very strong opinion on pricing, and it's fairly disruptive because I would say for a lot of SaaS companies, they start with the traditional freemium model. They start with maybe a 3-tiered pricing plan. How did you really think about like what would be that right premium price, and what were some of the mechanics that went into that model?
Yeah, so I kind of grew up in the Web 2.0 social media phase of Silicon Valley when freemium was very much all the rage. The intention behind Rapportive, my last company, was that it would be a freemium company. And I think I made the mistake that many founders do, which is you just kind of forget to monetize. And it almost becomes this fear of, oh, well, we have millions of users, but maybe they'll go away if we start charging for this thing. And it's painful to go back and start putting in paywalls for stuff that people have fallen in love with your product or your brand for. And I think since that time, and I'm talking about 10 years ago now, we as an industry have seen, we've learned lessons about freemium. People thought back then that it was a business model. I don't actually think that freemium is a business model now. I think that freemium is a marketing tactic or a strategy that you can use, and it's actually one that's applicable in way fewer scenarios than may initially make sense. And many, many companies died on this altar of freemium. And so with that scar tissue, I went into Superhuman saying, I'm going to do the complete opposite. This is going to be a premium product, everyone has to pay, and it's going to cost, compared to everything else, quite a lot of money. So that was sort of a preconception going in. Now, there are some other advantages to doing that. Very few people are trying to do it. It's very hard to do. It takes a lot of capital to pull off. So if you happen to be the kind of person who can raise a lot of capital, and actually anyone can do this, it just turns out to be a function of practice, then it gives you strategic advantages that other people don't have.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. When you think about a freemium, or when you think about a premium product and you think about things like blazing fast, like what are the metrics internally that you're measuring, and how do you think about what is the definition of a blazing fast product?
Oh, really, really great question. I could talk for days about this, but don't worry, I won't. So there are so many things that go into the feeling of blazingly fast. And I think that's the first thing to identify, is we're talking about a feeling. And so it's all about the perception that the user has. So to give you some examples of things that we care about tremendously, one of the most fundamental is a thread show. This is a metric that we track that is how long it takes for when you open an email thread for it to appear on the screen. Now, when Paul Buchheit, who was the inventor of Gmail at Google, when he sat down to build Gmail, he had this rule, which is every single interaction should take place in 100 milliseconds or less, because that's the threshold at which things feel instantaneous. But today, Gmail isn't like that. Opening an email can take a second, searches can take many seconds. And so when we sat down to build Superhuman, we said that, we're going to bring this rule back. Now, when you're defining a performance metric, you actually need two numbers. You can't just say it's 100 milliseconds. You need a confidence threshold as well. So you need to be able to say something like 99% of all thread shows will happen in 100 milliseconds or less, which is actually probably too hard. So maybe in this case, the right threshold is 90% of all thread shows will happen in 100 milliseconds or less. And then you want to set up simple reporting, and most importantly, alerting. Unless you build the alerting, then none of this works. So you can track this over time. And we haven't quite reached this level of sophistication yet, but it's something that I want to put in place over the course of next year. If a commit, if a build slows down that metric by more than 10%, or if a build pushes it over the threshold, then that build should fail. And it shouldn't automatically promote out of Canary and into production. So that's like a little piece of muscle memory that you can build into your engineering practice. And that's like the really raw metric definition of performance. But there's also perceptual stuff as well. I used to be a video game designer by background, and there's so much that we've added to Superhuman that's essentially video game design. And one of the concepts from video game design that we think about a lot is this idea of affordance. And there's a really great analogy, which is think about a mop or a broom. If you buy a really cheap mop or a really cheap broom, it's just going to be a rectangular piece of material that is fixed to a stick, and you just move it around. And there's no hinge or anything like that. It's kind of not very fun. If you buy an expensive mop or a broom, there's going to be a ball and socket joint there. And they'll market it by saying something like, now you can get into the corners you can never get into before, whatever, like some bullshit marketing. But the real reason why it's there is because it actually makes it fun to use. The object now has an affordance, and you can kind of start dancing around your room and feeling as much of a badass as you can feel when you're mopping your room. Now, I think there's a lot of lessons to learn from that. And so one of the things that we do inside of Superhuman, I know a lot of people here use the product. You hit J and K to change the thread that you're looking at, right? Now, let's say you're on the inbox and you're doing that. We've set the timer of that animation very specifically. So let's say you hold down J. I believe the default key refresh rate inside macOS is 70 or 80 milliseconds. I forget what it is exactly. So we actually looked that up, and we set our key refresh rate to be 10 milliseconds faster than that. But it doesn't actually make you meaningfully go faster, that particular tweak, but it does make the product feel a hell of a lot faster. And it's like the mop or the broom with the ball and socket joint.
What's interesting about Superhuman, I feel like you've mentioned the concept of feelings quite a bit, and I think that speed is one component, but can you talk about even things like, what happens when you get to inbox 0, or what are some other things that you've sort of woven into the product that are more of a surprise and delight sort of moment?
Sure. So there are so many things that I spent the last few days trying to come up with a good framework to pull it all together, and this sort of ties into the video game background. So I think I'll start by saying most companies, most product management practices worry about what users want or what they need. But we don't worry about that at all. We obsess about how users feel. And we have a saying inside of Superhuman, which is, what we make users feel is just as important as what we make. And what we actually make is joy in software form. Now, if you look at the structure of a game, games have specific things that make them games. They have a goal, they have controls, they have tutorial levels, usually, they have a pace, they have a reward, and they have an inherent cycle. So let's analyze Superhuman briefly against all of those things. The goal of Superhuman is to get to inbox 0. And even if you're not the kind of person who wants to, maybe historically you never did, maybe you just marked things as unread, we'll use the onboarding to talk about the benefits of adopting this goal and how much less stress you'll feel and how much more awesome you'll feel if you actually adopt it. So we sell the goal. And almost every user that we onboard adopts that goal. Then you have the controls. Now, controls are a key part to any game experience. Again, it goes back to that mop analogy. That's an example of a control, an affordance that's really fun. And sometimes it's actually the defining characteristic of a game or of a platform. Probably the best example was the original Wii, where that motion control made it applicable to several hundred million people. And in Superhuman, it's the keyboard shortcuts. For many people, this is a novel form of control, even though they've been around for 30 years or whatever, that feels incredible. So you have the goal, you have the control, then you have the tutorial level. And that really is the function of the onboarding. You get to hang out with us, we get to teach you the controls, show you the goal. This is exactly the same as in any video game. And in a safe place, in your inbox with a friendly person, you get to try out the controls that you just learned and use these new moves. Now, any good game has pace. It needs to feel snappy and feel like you're moving along. And that's where the speed aspect of Superhuman comes in. That's why it's important that the emails show in 100 milliseconds or less, or that when you hold down J, the thing moves quickly. You need to feel immersed so you can achieve a state of flow and a feeling of focus. So that's pace. Now, every single game also needs to reset inherently. And the wonderful thing about email as a medium is that it is constantly resetting. So we don't get to control the rate at which our inbox fills up. And we also don't get to control the difficulty or the content of responding to each email. So some of the most compelling video game experiences are those that happen at a variable rate and with variable difficulty, because you never really know what the next one's going to be. And email is precisely like that. We didn't even have to do anything to make that the case. That's just the nature of email. So across a goal, across a control, across the onboarding experience, which is the tutorial level, across the pace, across the inherent cycle, you have the perfect ingredients for what is essentially a video game. And then you can start to layer things on top of that, things from the brand that actually heavily reinforce that. So the name itself, Superhuman, it speaks to you. You are the superhuman. You're the main character. You're the protagonist in this game. And by playing it, you become brilliant at what you do. And then we also layer things around and outside of the product experience. So as folks probably know, we have a big wait list. There's 220,000 people on the wait list. If you want to skip past that wait list, what we ask you to do is to go to Twitter, to find someone who's using it, and to ask for a referral. And for anyone who's played a role-playing game, you'll immediately recognize this as the very first quest that you're given in any role-playing game. It's just sort of, this is the practice that you should do. It's like, the first thing that you would do in Zelda. And so I think it's a really interesting unifying theory of how we've taken all of the concepts that make video games work and applied them to Superhuman.
Yeah, it's awesome. I mean, I think from a product standpoint, once you learn the shortcuts and once you become a power user, it's amazing to see just the number of people who are sharing their beautiful inbox zero photo on Twitter or the number of people who ask for an invite. What are some other things that you're thinking about, from a productivity standpoint? Like, are you starting to think even about how teams will adopt the product, or, are there changes that you'd like to make across even calendars? Like, how are you viewing sort of the broader work stack and some of the other jobs to be done?
Sure. So I think Teams is a really interesting question. I had this debate with Mathilde, the CEO of Front, many, many years ago, where we hold completely opposite opinions on this. I believed that you could not start multiplayer and go single player because the DNA of your company becomes around serving a specific team. And we were just talking about this earlier. And I think she holds the opposite opinion. So in my opinion, I've always believed that it's worth it, although probably harder, to absolutely nail the consumer single-player use case before you start going into Teams. And I think if you look at the difference in market cap between Dropbox and Box, you have the perfect example of what happens when you have a company that nailed single-player and is now starting to penetrate enterprise, and a company that just said, you know what, we're all about Teams from the get-go. So we're very much trying to be like Dropbox and say, let's nail that single-player experience first. Now that leads you to an interesting question, which is, what does the Superhuman team look like? And I'm much more interested in horizontal teams than vertical teams. So I think a vertical team would be an example of customer support that Front's doing excellently at, sales that Mixmax is doing excellently at. But I'm interested in, what does a horizontal team look like? What does it mean to get all of the executives inside of a company onto Superhuman, or all of the managers? And that's actually naturally where we're oriented. We see that expansion happening very organically. And maybe we end up with exactly the same features, but they're tweaked differently and they're marketed differently and the benefits are different, and it just feels like a completely different beast. So that's how we think about teams. In terms of what are we going to build, I've written a lot about this. Last year, I wrote that products market fit piece, and we continue to run the products market fit engine. And for those who don't know, the TLDR is really simple. Spend about half of your time doubling down on the stuff that people really like, and half of the time systematically overcoming objections to adoption from your target market. And one of the biggest things that we see is the quality and the caliber of our calendar integration. So we have a pretty basic calendar integration right now. It's over on the right-hand side. It's read-only. You can't, add to your calendar from the sidebar. It's basically version 0.1. And so you can expect to see a lot more work in there. This is why we raised a big fat Series B from Andreessen Horowitz. We're massively stepping up on hiring so we can do this and a lot of other stuff.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's interesting to see, when you think about single-player mode in the context of work, are there certain considerations that you think about as far as general productivity? Because right now you're tackling email, you may move into more rich calendar features, which then goes into more scheduling and kind of multiplayer by design, because individuals will meet in the context of a meeting. How are you thinking about sort of moving from single player to multiplayer? Do you want to maintain and double down on single player because there's that much more opportunity, or how do you think about those two worlds?
I think it's a really, really fascinating product question. And I find myself personally just drawn to this idea. I have this intense interest in, how do you make it work without the concept of a team, right? So let's take scheduling or task management. These are two obvious multiplayer features. Scheduling, how do I arrange a meeting with any of you in the audience? Or how do you send me a task in my email and have your email clients know that it's assigned to me? Two super obvious ideas. For the most part, every single startup that has attempted to do either one of those has assumed that there is a concept of a team. Now, what happens if we don't assume that? And again, to go back to the Dropbox example, Dropbox is an example of a company that started by started without that assumption. You could share a folder with anybody. And Box started with that assumption. You had to be part of a team or an enterprise to get access to a folder. It's a pretty unpopular approach these days. I think most companies, probably because it's easier, right? The use cases are more obvious. Pick a team, whether it's sales or support or whatever, and go after the use cases of that team. But I don't know, maybe because I'm masochistic when it comes to products, I'm like pulled to the, how do we make this horizontal? How do we make it work so that you and I can schedule even if we're not on the same team?
Do you think about what that maybe means even from a retention standpoint? Because one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is as more people are moving into distributed teams, or as we're thinking about even just general employee retention at tech companies, like when you build a product that's primarily single player, does that mean that it's a lot easier, it's more portable from one company to another, or it becomes more of your part of your personal tech stack, so to speak, rather than leaning too heavily on something that work will issue you?
Yeah, Superhuman turns out to be incredibly portable. It's much easier, for example, than bringing, I'm going to pick random productivity companies, than bringing Notion or Airtable into a new organization, because you don't have to convince anybody else to start using Superhuman. You can, by yourself, become twice as fast as your email simply by using it. But it's a double-edged sword. We have not built network effects or team features into it from the get-go. And so we've had to come up with other ways of fostering virality, where arguably, other companies haven't had to lean into brand and marketing like we do. We've chosen specifically to emphasize the single-player aspect of it. And it just means we've had to operate, I think, at a higher level at some of these other marketing activities than other companies.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Kind of taking a step back, I'd love to maybe walk through some key moments in the company's journey. I know, especially with a product like Superhuman, where a lot of us have seen it, a number of people in the audience have also DM'd me to get access to it. It's one of those things where we see a lot about Superhuman, but I'd love to learn a little bit more about, you talked about finding product market fit and what that looked like in the context of, your second company. Which is very much similar to the last one. Like, what have been some differences, and what have been some changes you've made from Reportive to moving into Superhuman?
I mean, there are a million differences. The first time around, I had literally no idea what I'm doing. Now I have a little bit of an idea of what I'm doing. I would say the biggest difference is we are now incredibly intentional about everything we do. I think after, it's been almost 10 years. It'll be 10 years next year since my last company. And I've realized that one of my core strengths, this is also true of my two co-founders and also our executive team, is the five of us, we are probably the most intentional, deliberate people you'll ever meet, to the point of pedantry. But leveraged properly, that's actually really powerful, right? We come up with all of these frameworks all of the time, whether it's the product's market fit thing, or it's how we think about pricing, or it's how we think about game design. And they're all incredibly well thought through. So back at Reportive, I wasn't like that. And the reason why I wasn't like that is I was still trying to figure out how to play the game, right? Most of my time was going into, how do you hire? What is a term sheet? How do I meet investors? Oh my God, our servers are on fire. How do we scale? Right? Some really, really basic stuff, to the point where in a given year, I probably spent one day thinking about strategy. And guess what? You're not going to build a successful company if most of your mind space is occupied with, how do I play the game? So it's a little bit different now, where I don't really worry about that stuff anymore. I feel like I have pretty good frameworks for all of the above. And so I spend just a lot more time thinking about company strategy.
Yeah, I love that. And I like that you use the word intentional as well, because I think that is a very It's sort of a new philosophy, I would say, for SaaS companies. I think in the last generation, there are no shortage of blog posts online that tell you what to do at this ARR milestone, or what person to hire, what type of person to hire. It's great to hear, how much conviction you have for the things that you're building. And it's not influenced by, competitors or products that were built in the last generation of great SaaS companies. What are some things that you would encourage seed and Series A founders to consider as they're thinking about both their product roadmap, as they have influence from maybe investors or even feedback from customers? Like, what are some things that you typically offer to entrepreneurs as far as like how to stay focused and how to have that same level of conviction for what they're building?
So I'll mention maybe 3 things more if I think of them. Number 1, raise about twice as much money as you think you need. And not for the reason you might think. It's not because you'll burn money faster than people will tell you to. I actually think, sidebar, that by itself is a fallacy. I've always had north of 5 years of runway in the company at any given moment of the company. And people kept on telling me, oh my God, you want to spend money really fast. And I would just look at them and think, no, I don't know why you're saying that, because I know myself, I know I won't. I'm sort of very calm about how I spend money. The real reason why you want that money is it gives you incredible leverage in every single negotiation scenario you'll ever have. Whether it's with a potential investor, with a potential acquirer, with a candidate you're trying to hire, you can literally walk away from any conversation at any point, and you'll be a more attractive, more expensive company a year from now, if not 5 years from now. So that's the number 1 thing I would do. And it actually turns out to be relatively easy, because the more runway you have, the easier it is to raise money. So that's the first thing. The second thing is resist the call from your investors to grow if you don't have product market fit. Now, this especially happens after Series A. Seed investors usually know a little bit better than to push on premature growth, but you do need to make some big step-ups from Series A to Series B. And oftentimes, that pressure can turn into basically hope over reality, and you start scaling a business model that breaks over time. And so it's really important to identify those key metrics, to have reporting and alerting in place so that you're not prematurely growing. And I would say the third thing is, this is actually a phrase given to me by one of my own VCs, don't get VC'd. So being VC'd is when you're at a board meeting or whatever, you're meeting one of your investors, and they ask the question, they're like, hey, why don't we have a mobile app? And you're like, well, because we don't have the engineers to build a mobile app. And they're like, well, we should have a mobile app because X, Y, Z. Now, the thing is, they're probably correct. You probably should have a mobile app in that scenario, but you have to go about doing it in a very responsible way. It usually means raising another 4 or 5 million, taking the 6 months it would take to hire an engineering or a product leader, and then having them build out the team. What I've seen many founders do is that they're like, okay, fine, let's just start building a mobile app. And they'll either run out of money or they'll dilute the focus of their team, or both. So those are 3 things that I would advise.
Yeah, that's great. In terms of kind of building on focus for the team, I know that you have very intentional co-founders. What are some things that you think about when hiring someone? What makes a good candidate for a person who, applies at Superhuman? How have you thought about maintaining that thoughtfulness as you scale?
Yeah, great question. So this just comes down to company values and making sure those values are in your hiring plan. So we have 3 company values that we consider to be core values. And so, actually, let me just get a quick show of hands so I can tune this answer. How many folks here have gone through a thoughtful and intentional process to come up with their company values? Okay, so it looks like maybe 40-50% of the room. So that's step number 1, is to come up with them. And if you haven't, a really great book, and we followed this book as our process, is a book called The Advantage. And they identify a number of different categories of value. There's core values, which are inherent to the company. You can credibly claim to have been doing them since your inception. You'll do them forever. You can claim to do them better than 99% of all other companies, and you'll even do them to the extent that it will hurt the company. Those are the most important ones to identify. Then there's aspirational values. These are values that you need to acquire in order to become successful. Then there's pay-to-play values. These are boring values like do good, right? Great, whatever. Unless you're actually going to do good better than 99% of other companies, it probably shouldn't be on your list. So write them down, get rid of them. You just kind of have to get through them. So you want to identify those core values. And for us, they are create delight, number 1, be intentional, number 2, and remarkable quality, number 3. And in any single phone screen with any candidate, we talk about these things and we explain them. And so create delight is the most important one. This actually comes from our game design background. So it turns out that if you look into the sort of the theory of emotion behind game design, that there's a very specific definition of what delight is. Delight you can define as pleasant surprise. And personally, I find this very fascinating because it turns out that the opposite of delight, which is disgust, you can define as unpleasant surprise. And so the simple human, it's not even an emotion, it's a reaction surprise. When you modify it as either unpleasant or pleasant, you end up with disgust or delight. And everything that we do inside of Superhuman is around creating delight, either for our customers or for our candidates or for each other in the company. We talk about that. We talk about what it means to be intentional, and we talk about remarkable quality. And the word remarkable is extremely important there. That means quality that's so good that our users feel compelled to talk about it to other people. That's actually basically, I think, the only way that you can build a brand that sustains.
Awesome. Well, I want to be mindful of your time. Thanks so much for joining us today. Really enjoyed the discussion, and on behalf of a Superhuman power user, and I know a lot of other folks in this audience are using it as well. It's really great to have you.
Thank you.